So, Cosmo and Barry, welcome. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. For people who do not know who you both are, would you mind just introducing yourselves a little bit and telling us a little bit about your background?
Surely, Cosmo, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Cosmo Buono. I've worn several hats as a musician. I started as a solo pianist. I became part of a two-piano team. I'm a Steinway artist. And now I find that I'm doing more work with students all over the world, which gives me enormous pleasure. I love teaching. I love sharing the traditions of our great art with students. And this gives me the most pleasure in life right now. And just helping the next generation of musicians and also spreading this great art form to the world is an enormous pleasure for me.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Barry?
But my name is Barry Alexander, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Alexander and Buono International. I started out as an opera singer. My mother was an opera singer, as a matter of fact, and so I've been singing just pretty much all of my life. And after I finished a career in performance of about 30 years, I came back to the United States and started a public relations firm for classical musicians. Following that, as matters evolved, Cosmo and I decided to embark on a business together, and we have formed Alexander and Buono International, which initially was a consulting firm for classical musicians, but it has evolved into both a for-profit and non-profit side, so that we now have our own 501c3, and within the framework of the consulting firm, we help artists to build and sustain their careers, partially through 4 competitions for piano, voice, strings, and flute, where we offer these winners a performance debut at Carnegie Hall. In addition, we have an academy that is designed to give artists all of the tools and intellectual equipment that they need to understand how to have a career, to be their own advocate in terms of the entrepreneurship that is part of having a career, and moving things forward through as much education as we possibly can surrounding technique as well as performance.
Outstanding. So I think the idea of this talk today as a first building block, and what will hopefully be more, is to give people, right, the pure audio video audience or people who are listening to this, a sense of, we want to bring a new level of enthusiasm, appreciation, and respect for the power that music can have in our lives, that we oftentimes, rather than having it in the background all the time, we want to bring it to the forefront and show the benefits that it can give to people if you sit down and give it a chance and appreciate it. So with that being said, I'll start with Cosmo. Cosmo, what was your first experience that you can remember as a child with music? What was that first impression?
My very first memory as a child is of my older sister playing the piano. And then, of course, I went over to the piano and annoyed her terribly while she was trying to practice. But I was always drawn, music just drew me like a magnet.
So ever since you can remember, it drew you like a magnet, and then you just kept. I'm imagining that your sister was playing, your parents just encouraged that, and you just kept developing?
Yes, I was very fortunate because I grew up in a small town in New Jersey, and when I was 4, my parents took me to a concert pianist who lived very close by. And she and her husband, who was also a concert pianist, would play 2 pianos. And she was very kind, very patient, very motherly with me, and really imparted the joy of music and the love of music, I think, or at least fostered what was already there. And I remember hearing the 2 of them play at a concert, And I was just mesmerized by it. Just two pianos. I couldn't think of anything better than that.
Amazing. How can you give us an example of how your teachers fostered that love that was already kind of building inside of you? What did they do specifically?
Sure. And it's what I hope I do as a teacher as well, is you talk to the student. You don't just tell the student what to do. There are certain things that have to be done. Of course, you have to learn the right notes, the right rhythms, and all of that. But then beyond that, music should come to life differently in every artist's hands because we bring our life experience, we bring our perception of a particular piece, and we're sharing that with an audience. And or just sharing it with the four walls, it doesn't matter. But you're interpreting it. And she would always encourage me, even as a little child, she would say, well, now what do you think this is about? Inevitably, I'd give her an answer that was way out there, but it's okay. You learn to start thinking critically that way. And that is the thing I think she gave me, which is so wonderful.
That's fantastic. Barry?
Well, as I mentioned, my mother was an opera singer, so I was always surrounded by music. And to hear her tell it, what happened was that I was constantly mimicking her as she was around the house rehearsing. And she decided around age 3 to see if I really had talent of any kind. So she taught me a few songs. And as matters progressed, I was giving a recital at age 4. I grew up in the church and was very active, and so I was singing and then also reciting poetry. And as it moved along, the excitement for me was, of course, not just with being able to sing, but to go to these wonderful events where I was all dressed up and everybody was shaking my hand and telling me how well I had done. And I think the real turning point, because I did a lot of performing between, say, the ages of 4 and 9, but at age 9, I got a real glimpse of how powerful music can be, because my parents took me to opening night of the Metropolitan Opera, and I was as mesmerized by all of the glamour of seeing people in men in white tie and women in evening gowns as I was by what went on the stage. And it changed my life simply because I saw that the artists on the stage were able to use the music to communicate. And I remember feeling happy and sad and excited and just really dazzled by everything that I saw and heard. And I decided right within that performance that I wanted to do the same thing in terms of hopefully inspiring other people to feel the same kind of excitement when they listened to music that it brought to me. And one more important thing about this is that in anticipation of my going to hear this performance of La Boheme, which was the opening night performance there for the Met, my father bought all of the records, and back then they were not CDs, they were those LPs, those 33 and a third RPM, and these things came in huge boxes with the libretto and, of course, all of the stories of the opera. And I remember just reading this and feeling as though this was better than any kind of fairy tale that you could read. So just anticipating the performance was very inspiring in and of itself. And quite honestly, with my work with singers now and our consulting all over the world, that excitement remains with me to this day because of the capacity music has to inspire in so many vibrant ways.
Absolutely. I'm curious to know, so with Cosmo, did you have an experience like that when you started performing where something triggered for you similarly?
You know, I can't say that there was one thing. Music has always been the focal point of my life. And every time I thought of doing something outside of music professionally, it didn't last very long. It was just always during, and I just wanting to learn as much as I possibly could about music. So I found myself reading history books about music, biographies of the composers. And that was just always just part of my being.
Interesting. Barry, when did you, I mean, I hear the excitement in your voice too when we talk about music. So the possibility to inspire, to change the course of a life. Obviously, you're both gifted musicians, but this was clearly a talent that you also had to develop and work at. Did it ever feel like work when you were performing? Did it ever feel like, I'm a little bit burnt out of this, or I'm not sure I can do this, or was it just this wellspring of energy and enthusiasm that just kind of kept building as you saw what it could do?
Well, for me, it was that, and my people would always ask me if I would get nervous before I performed. Even as a child, that was a question one heard a lot. And I said, no, I'm just always excited because I felt that the music was so uplifting for me that I just wanted to share that the same way that you would, run down the street with your new toy that your parents had gotten you and share it with your friend who lived a couple of doors down. It was always that excitement for me. And it really wasn't until I got older and was taking lessons of all different kinds that I realized how much work was involved in it. However, even then, I found myself thinking that the work just supplied me with still more tools by which to share my enthusiasm. Another significant point for me was just in terms of the developing technology then, because I had an uncle who was an avid music enthusiast, and he had rather elaborate stereo equipment in his house. And I can remember again, with the 33 RPM records, there was a kind of cleaning off of the records and then dusting of the needle and so forth, and very meticulously placing the needle on the record. But what I believed then, as he was doing all of this and kind of educating me to this ritual, the quality of the sound was so different from what I would hear, say, for example, on a transistor radio when I was listening to the Metropolitan Opera Saturday broadcast, or even this equipment that was not as sophisticated as his. And I began to hear all sorts of overtones and undertones that just made the music for me 10 times more exciting. And when I would take my opera records to his home and listen to them, they sounded like completely different performances because I was hearing things that I didn't even hear before. For example, there was one scene in an opera called Lucia de l'Amour where she's being handed a letter by her brother, and I could hear on his equipment the rustling of the paper as he handed her the letter, and I'd listened to that at least 20 times at home and never heard that. So it really opened up an entirely new world, as much because of what I was learning as a singer as because of seeing how this sophisticated equipment and the technology amplified all of these things to turn sound into almost a springboard for the imagination, because you could see things even as you were listening to them.
Yep. If you close your eyes on a good enough sound system, your mind very easily, the suspension of disbelief drops very quickly. You feel like the performers are in the room with you.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly it. I felt as though I was in a concert hall or I was at an operatic performance sitting on the first row. And I don't think anybody can underestimate the power that has to totally enhance and totally transform the listening experience, because they're not even nuances. It's as though the entire performance gets taken to another realm, another sphere of both appreciation and understanding. Another thing that did that for me was when they took all of the Enrico Caruso cylinders, which were these wax cylinders on which he made his original recordings, and then when those got transferred to CDs, which was the next step in all of this marvelous technology, I just could not believe how glorious that voice sounded. And that, for me too, was an inspiration, because you could hear capacities of resonance and qualities there that as a singer made me want to incorporate more of the technique that allowed his singing to sound so brilliant. So these things did a lot to contribute all along the way, an inspiration for the voice becoming as good as I could make it.
Very interesting. Um, I think there's a lot to be said there, but I'm also curious. I think there's an important point to make here, right? Especially with classical music, with jazz, with certain types of music. A point that Cosmo made earlier, where his teacher would ask him, "What do you think the artist is trying to say here? What do you think this piece is about?" And what we see with people who get enthusiastic about something is that they want to learn more. They want to dive into it more to understand more about it. This is true with wine. This is true with cars. I don't think this happens often enough with music. With music, you hear a pop song, you kind of get it the first time. A good pop song you can hear 100 times, but you kind of memorize it and know it. I think with other forms of music, I personally love classical music. You have to work. You have to put some work. You have to put some effort into understanding the piece. And you can hear a piece 100 times, 200 times. Suddenly, you hear it from a new composer, and it's like you're picking up things that you never realized were there. Can you both talk a little bit about why that is, and how we can help people do a better job of approaching these other forms of music and getting excited about it?
Sure, Gustavo. Um, Classical music does require a bit of education. I mean, people can enjoy it with no education at all about music, but knowing something about what the composer's aims were, when the composer was working, are very, very useful. But what you were saying is absolutely true. I think I heard Beethoven's Fifth Symphony when I was in grammar school. And I heard it the other day and I stopped dead in my tracks because it was like greeting an old friend. And as you said, I heard something new in it. I suspect I'll always hear something new in it because the music is so great. It's like reading a Shakespeare play or any other great work of art, or looking at a great painting. You come back to it and you think, why didn't I see that there? Now I do. And you hear people say classical music has no relevance anymore. And I think that is the worst lie that one can make, because classical music does. Beethoven was writing. Well, I find it very moving, Beethoven, whenever I think about him, because he became deaf when he was 30 years old. He considered committing suicide because of that. And yet, he wrote some of his greatest and many of his greatest and most complex compositions stone cold deaf. The story about the Ninth Symphony is he was sitting on stage with his back to the audience because he was watching the orchestra and the choristers sing. And when the applause started, he had to be turned around to see it because he was stone cold deaf. And yet, he was writing about the brotherhood and the joy of all humanity. So if he, and I tell this to students because if he can transcend it, that there isn't anything we can't transcend in our lives. So there are just so many things. And then there is the therapeutic value of music. Study after study has shown that it helps the brain development of children and adults. And there is something even called the Mozart effect, where listening to Mozart before a test or before studying frees the mind to accept the information more readily.
Do we know why that's the case? Or
Scientists do. I can't understand it. So I wouldn't be, I can only report, I can't explain it.
Okay, understood. And I agree. I used to do that in college. Was just listen to Mozart, before studying, before a test, and I wasn't sure if it worked, but at the very least, I knew that psychologically, I was more primed, and I enjoyed listening to it anyway. So, but the Beethoven story, is incredibly powerful. He is my favorite classical artist, and for me, the ninth is a piece that I don't listen to as often as I used to, but I do listen to it. I make it a special occasion when I listen to it, about at least once a year when I'm feeling like I want to be grateful again, and I want to really open myself up to the joy of life and kind of reconnect with that deep gratitude of just being alive and living. I go and I listen to the ninth, and it always, always, always hits home. So if I'm alone and I'm listening to it, I will cry. If I'm at a performance or I'm with other people, I'll keep the emotion a little bit more in check, but it never fails to move me.
I tend to think that part of that, Gustavo, for all of us, is that the music has a capacity to reach our emotions in a way and trigger thoughts and responses that no amount of verbal articulation can ever do. In the same way, and this is what I tell students sometimes, in the same way that you can smell something in the present that will take you back 20 years in your past because you associate that smell with a particular event or some pleasant experience. I believe that music has the capacity, almost unwittingly for us, to tap into some of the deeper recesses of our thoughts and our emotions because of the way the notes are configured and because of the way that I think the body is designed to respond to certain sounds. One hears a lot nowadays about women putting earphones on their tummies when they're pregnant to play classical music for the children. And I believe that the connection is with the fact that there is a kind of soothing quality, but also an unspoken identifier on the part of the music. It taps into something that you're feeling even without your knowing that you are feeling it. It's why, to your point, when you hear something like the ninth, there this idea of joy and all of that allows you the reaction without having to configure all of the emotions and all of the influences that are sparking that reaction. And that is what makes music, I think, so powerful. It's why, people will just hear even just strains of a particular melody, and even if they're hearing it for the first time, it can be so moving. And there is that unarticulated and perhaps very unempirical quality about music that we can't overlook. And I think that the only reason that classical music gets such a bad reputation is because people feel that since most of it was written in centuries of which they weren't a part, that it has no real historical relevance. It's too far removed historically. But examination of any piece of music allows you to realize how universal the emotions are, and also how much the composers were living in the world that inspired their writing, and how similar that is to anything that's going on today. So to just feel as though it's removed because it was written hundreds of years ago is to discount the fact that these composers were writing out of their own humanity the same way the composers do today. And what happens is that and I always like to think about this. They say that if Mozart, if Beethoven were living today, they would be the rock stars of this generation. We would be listening to them the way that we listen to other more popular artists today. So it's certainly not without its relevance.
Absolutely. I think some people are also put off by the sense of, well, the genius of Mozart. How can I possibly understand? I have to be either classically trained or somehow really into it or educated to appreciate it. But to me, I don't look at it that way. I approach it from the vantage point of any great artist. Their greatness, at least in part, has to do with their ability to communicate the human experience to many, many people, so that it may not be, yes, classical music may be a little abstract in some sense, but in another sense, they're trying to make you feel a certain way. And if they're great at what they're doing, they're going to succeed whether you're familiar with the piece or not. It's just the more you learn about it, the more you develop a taste for it, the more appreciation you get out of it. You think that's accurate?
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, on one hand, anybody can understand classical music. Beethoven's writing about joy in the Ninth Symphony. We all can express that. Mozart in his operas, people say, oh, opera, that's so difficult to say. No, he's got very real characters in there, and he's often writing about love and various aspects of love. Well, who can't relate to that? And, I teach such a wide spectrum of students. I have classes, I have people who are trying to become concert pianists. But then I have children, and then another group are people who are professional people, doctors, lawyers, business people, and they're just passionate about it. And they're just learning as they're moving through this music as well. And we should never forget, these composers were not writing necessarily for somebody who had this enormous musical education. They were writing for people. This was the only music that was around, except for folk music. And so they were writing for everybody.
I also think that it's important to understand that much of what we consider as being non-classical music has as its roots classical training. For example, if you look at some of the improvisation that is associated with jazz, we think that that is unique to that particular art form. However, every classical musician, particularly singers, have to take improvisation classes, because you have to be able to create cadenzas on the spot. You have to know how to manage things on a piano that you would want to ultimately sing. And so there needs to be an understanding of certain aspects of music that are perhaps associated only with the classical realm, but that manifest themselves everywhere. The great pianist Oscar Peterson, who became a world-celebrated jazz pianist, had all of his roots in his classical training. And if one looks at singers like Renee Fleming, yes, she has made a great bulk of her living from the world of opera, but she sings on Broadway, and she has recordings of much more popular music, as do many other artists that are associated more exclusively with opera. So you have to understand that there are some ways in which these disciplines overlap, and there's a danger in excluding certain aspects of classical music as not existing anywhere else except within, say, opera or the classical realm, because they show up in other places all of the time.
Interesting. I'd like to just make a slight shift here, because this is a little bit of my selfishness and curiosity at play here. So, since I don't often get to talk to, world renowned, incredible musicians, can you talk to me a little bit about what is it like to perform on stage? What were some of your most memorable performances, and why were they so memorable for you? What was it? Was it the acoustics of the place? Was it the way the audience responded? Was it, some elements of both? Like, what am I missing? What was it about performing that just really gave you an experience unlike anything else?
Well, I would have to answer that in two ways. Carnegie Hall was the most, was the greatest place that I've ever performed in. Just the history, knowing that Tchaikovsky opened the hall, all my heroes performed there. And to walk on that stage is a thrill, an absolute thrill. You also feel a great obligation because of what I just said, of all those that have passed through. But in terms of audiences, one of most cherished memories is when I played in Bologna, Italy. And after the concert, a young man and a young woman came back, and the man didn't speak any English, and the woman was interpreting. And he seemed very insistent that I know something. And he said to me, "You know, I came to this concert with a terrible problem. For 2 hours, I didn't think about it. Thank you." And that, to me, says it all.
I think
Go ahead, Barry. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Please excuse me. For me, the experience was slightly different because so much of it was my wanting to make sure that I communicated to audiences as much of what the music meant to me as possible, that in rehearsal and in the studio, I was always going over and over again what would give the greatest import to the music. So I was holding it up to the light a lot of different ways. And the most satisfying and ultimately the most successful performances were the ones where I had rehearsed so much and studied so much exactly the way that I wanted to say and communicate what the music's meaning was for me, that when I was able to do as much of that as possible on stage, I was very, very, very delighted with that. And what was also intriguing in terms of an actual experience was once I was finishing out a concert, and as all of us artists do, we try to close out with some really rousing number. And I finished, and the piano sounded the last chord, but there were absolutely no applause for what seemed like an interminable amount of time. And then the auditorium broke into applause. And I took from that the idea that they really got the message, and the power of the message was such that for that brief moment when there were no applause, there was something about it that was inspiring to a level that went beyond just responding in the conventional kind of way. And I always remember that as being one of the performances that will always stay with me. So part of it for me was always making sure that I created the greatest power for the message that was in the music and considered the performances successful when I had done as much of that as possible.
Interesting. And when you're performing on stage, are you trained to feel and kind of respond to the audience, or is it more you're so in the moment of performing the piece, you're so inside of that expressiveness that you kind of forget that the audience is there until the end?
No, I think it's a little bit of both, because it's really kind of like the conversation that you would have with a good friend at a luncheon table. You know, you want them to respond to what it is that you have to say. And by the same token, you play off of their reactions to what you have said. But I also think that for artists, what you realize is that once you're on stage, it's kind of like what teachers used to tell you about taking a test. They'd say, well, if you don't know it by the time you get to the test, you're not going to learn it. And so you basically have to do as much in the way of preparing beforehand, and then let matters take their course as they will. Things will go in a way that is sometimes very unexpected once you're on stage, which can be very good, and which sometimes can maybe not be as comfortable or favorable as you might like. And you're required to deal with all of that. But the idea is to train yourself as an artist in such a way that you can handle whatever happens on that stage and remain in control of your own performance. Cosmo, what about you? How does that work for you?
No, I agree. It's a little bit of both, is that you've got to be focused, you've got to keep your concentration, but at the same time, you've got to feel it. And that's where the preparation comes in, is learning how to do that. But there is a communication, there's a silent communication with the audience. You can really hear from the stage when they're with you. And that's a wonderful, wonderful experience to have.
And so what's the sign there? What's the signal that you get? Is it just something that's kind of like primally wired into our brains when you feel that the audience is on stage? Because it's not like in classical music, it's not like going to a rock concert or a pop concert where people are up and dancing and shouting the whole time, right? They're quietly listening. So what do you feel? How
Well,
do you
you
know
know,
it?
I think a lot of it is primal, yes. But you can often hear if people are fidgeting in their seats, or somebody's in their bag fooling around with the keys or something, or they're coughing. Or the silence that you get when people are really engaged is just indescribable.
And I would have to say, too, Gustavo, that it's really the same kind of silence that you get when you have a captive audience and you're telling a good story. You know, people are listening in such a way that they don't want to miss any of the details that move the story forward. And if you've listened to recordings of orchestras or chamber orchestras where there are movements between a piece, you can always hear that everybody is waiting to cough or to move in any way until you get to the end of a movement, but before the next movement starts. There's an aspect of it that is not just about giving your attention, but because it's the polite thing to do, but also because you don't want to run the risk of missing any nuance or any subtlety of the performance and of the sound related to that performance that's going to ultimately enhance your enjoyment of what's being heard. And so that's why people listen very carefully and very cautiously, I might say, in order to make sure none of those nuances get missed.
Interesting. That is interesting. I think it's also interesting to when you're on that stage. Do you feel like, obviously with opera, right? You are telling a story. You're communicating a story through music. Cosmo, do you get that same sense when you're performing a piece? Like even if it's a piano sonata, is that piece a story?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, when I'm working with a student, I often say, what story do you want to tell with this piece? Because music, yes, it's abstract, but it's inspired by something. Now, we can never know what the composer's inspiration might have been, unless in some cases they tell us what it is. But often, if they title a work sonata, you don't know what it's about. That's not a very specific term, except for the form of the piece. So it's up to us as performers, and I tell students that's one of the great things, is it's up to us to decide the story, and then to how are we going to go about expressing that story to our audiences.
It's really not unlike, I think, Gustavo, if I can just if I can latch on to what you said, Cosmo. I think that part of it is like if you have 10 people reading the Gettysburg Address, those 10 you're going to get 10 interpretations of the same words, because certain aspects of those words and certain sentences and phrases are going to mean one thing to one person that are not quite the same as they would to someone else. So you're communicating, to Cosmo's point, and I think just our overall understanding of music and how we communicate using it, you're communicating a certain way in which you personally relate to the music. The same thing is true of, and this is one of the luxuries certainly of YouTube at this point, you can hear 20 different interpretations of the same aria by 20 different people, and it will never sound the same way. Yes, all of the notes will be the same, just like all of the words in the Gettysburg Address would be the same. But everybody brings to those notes a different focus, a different awareness, and a different interpretation, which makes for the inspiration being very different. It's why one person prefers one rendition or performance of a piece by a particular orchestra or a singer than they do another. It's because that particular rendition speaks to their own personal attitudes, ideas, and perspectives in a greater way. And to actually articulate what those differences are tends to take us back to the earlier part of this conversation, where it's really not about anything specific. It's much more about a visceral reaction that the music itself evokes in the listener. And that I don't think can ever be quantified or fully understood, no matter how sophisticated our science becomes.
I agree, and it's so interesting to me that when you, I'm not gonna, I'm not denigrating any of our other senses because it's all a part of the equation. But when we talk about music specifically, it's sound, but so much of it is about how it makes us feel.
Absolutely.
You don't get that same language around something visual, right? As much, anyways. Yes, a painting will make you feel a certain way, but sight doesn't tend to equate as much, I think, with feeling as our ears do, as through music. Would you agree with that? Or
Absolutely.
do you think I'm oversimplifying? Because I might be.
No, no, you're not oversimplifying it. Um, and people will have different reactions to it. Some people will feel exhilarated by a piece that another person finds perhaps sad or tragic even. It's open to that interpretation. And to your point that we feel, music, the whole field of music therapy is based on the fact that music can bypass the intellect if need be and get right to the emotions. So, people who may be profoundly mentally ill or have simply a problem like, for instance, autism, where they can't relate in some ways, musically they relate just perfectly. It goes right through to the emotions and to the heart.
Interesting. And part of that I would guess is like what Barry is that word visceral, right? Like when you hear a piano, it doesn't have to be a grand piano, but just say, a nice piano, a Steinway piano in a room with you, you're not just hearing the notes. There's physical sensation there. There's physical sensation to hearing a cello, to hearing bass play, a horn. It's I guess touch. It's not really touching you, but it is visceral. You are physically feeling it as well as hearing it.
Well, I also think that it's important to understand the physical aspect of sound over and against the responses that we have to something that is more of a visual medium. For example, if you listen to those bells that the monks chime when they're being called to prayer, obviously they're thinking when they hear that bell, they're associating it with a much more meditative time. But the vibrations that come from that bell actually penetrate the body in a physical, tactile way, which is the same thing that is true for music. And there is something that it is able to essentially transcend all of the physiological organs in such a way that it sparks a reaction not just from the ear but also the mind, and more importantly, the spirit. I think the music and the listening arts create much more of an actual conduit because they are literally vibrating into your spirit and into your soul. And that is the nature of music that is to be distinguished from other art forms, like, for example, painting and the visual arts. Uh, so when you look at a painting, you have a reaction to it from the standpoint of what it evokes in your mind, perhaps, but you're relying only on your vision at that point, and you're not really relying on anything in your system to talk back to an actual sensation like the vibrations that are part of the music. That's what makes the music so much more powerful, I think, because on a physical and physiological level, your body is reacting to it very actively with every single note that's being played.
That's a really, really, really interesting point. Thank you both for that. I'm glad I wasn't oversimplifying. Kind of to start to wrap up the talk, I know we have about an hour and we're almost there. I'm curious to know, how has your perspective on music either been enhanced or shifted once you started teaching, right? Once you started educating other people, what did you learn about music? How did your relationship to it change that wasn't there before?
Well, I advise any artist to teach. The great composers taught. Beethoven taught, Mozart taught, Bach taught, Liszt taught. Because when you have to articulate something to someone else, then you really know it. And then you really are. But something else happens in the course of articulating something. You start thinking about it. And then often the student will say something to you where you start thinking in a different way. I always say I learn as much from my students as they learn from me, because they will talk about music as they perceive it. And it's just as valid as what I perceive. You know, I may have a larger background in music and a few degrees in it, but their reactions to music are just as valid as my reaction to it. So it makes you reconsider things. And also, just the fact that the more you live, the more you experience life, the more you have to give to the music that you play.
I also think that the teaching provides you with a very unique perspective, because you get to see the music then not just through your own eyes, but through the eyes of the person whom you're teaching. And I believe there's a great proverb that says the best teachers are the ones who never stop learning. So that I think that while we do think of the teacher-student paradigm as being one where all of the information is being disseminated from the teacher to the student, there is a certain dimension of this that also represents reciprocity, because your perspective may be so solidified, having taught the same work for so long, that someone coming in with a fresh perspective and a new perspective that you have not had a chance to share before can actually feed into a level of communication that allows the piece to take on a certain freshness that it wouldn't otherwise have. And so it's like adding a new ingredient to an old recipe. It changes the perspective altogether. So this is something where the teaching becomes, I think, for both Cosmo and myself, a kind of experience where we're learning all the time, right along with the very same people that we're teaching.
Those are great answers. Great answers. My last question for both of you for today, and I have a feeling we're going to be doing more together as we move forward, but my last question: what have I missed in this conversation that you feel is important to talk about, even if just for a few minutes?
Well, first of all, I hope we have many more conversations. This has been a real pleasure. I don't think you missed anything, but I would just like to emphasize the point that music, and great music, is for everyone. And it can elevate us, it can move us into different worlds and into different fields of emotion. And I do believe that this old world really needs it now more than ever. And I feel very fortunate to be a part of this, but I would encourage anyone who has any interest in music not to be intimidated by Beethoven or by Schubert or by Mozart, but just embrace it to the capacity that you can, and this will grow, and this will become easier for you.
And if I can just add to that, Gustavo, I think certainly I want to echo what Cosmo said. This is a great source of joy for me, being able to have this kind of conversation and these kinds of conversations. But I would like us to, in future discussions, talk about music's capacity to meet us where we are, no matter where that placement is. For example, there are things that music can do to either crystallize or clarify emotions, or one can create can achieve an awareness of a certain feeling or a certain sentiment because it's already been articulated and put down in a song or in a work that carries along with it a mood that is very reflective of the mood of the listener. And we can talk a little bit more about how music is really designed to meet us all where we are. And even though it may be part of a genre that we're not particularly acquainted with, there are still things to be learned no matter what. The stories are drawn from life. The individuals who write the music, no matter what kind it is, are reacting to their own experiences, and that creates a kind of universal listening room where one can come to achieve a certain understanding even though he may not be fully familiar with the kind of music that is being performed.
That's that's beautifully said. Thank you. And I look forward to talking about that more. Final thing is, where can people find you both? I think it's fascinating that you are teaching people who are not, in line to be professional musicians, who just want to deepen their appreciation. I think that's fantastic. I'm actually very curious to join that program. So where can our audience find more about you both? Find out more about you both.
Well, all they have to do is log on to our two websites. One is Alexander Buono, that's BUONO.com, and then alexanderbuono.org. One of those two websites will give you all of the information you need to have about our work and the programs that we have implemented, the different concerts that we produce, and also the vast array of lectures and courses that are part of our work and our goal to help as many people as possible achieve their dreams within the realm of classical music.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for the time. This was phenomenal. Thank you.
Thank you. Our pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.